On the busy streets of London, nothing could be more tempting than the wafts of delicious, tasty morsels coming from the many different food vendors which littered the streets. Imagine if you were starving and if all you could smell all around you were the tempting and mouth-watering scents of tasty morsels, but you had no money to pay for them. Would you be able to resist? For one man in the 1820s, he had to endure the temptation of the food which was within reach but out of budget, until one day he couldn't take it any longer. But would this one-off blip in judgment turn out to be a grave mistake or a wise career move? Today on Macabre Mini Mysteries, we uncover the story of the man who stole 1,000 oysters, Edward Dando. And welcome back to another episode of Macabre Mini Mysteries. I'm Nikki Druce, your host with a silent G, and today we're delving into a little tale from London which will leave your tummy grumbling, perhaps for all the wrong reasons. So if you're put off by gluttony and overeating, make sure you've got some Rennies to hand to ease that heartburn, because we're delving into a very odd tale of overconsumption. As we'll be diving back into the Crime and Punishment series and covering the topic I said I'd never do, Jack the Ripper, in the next episode, it just seemed right to have a shorter and lighter tale first to balance things out, but one which is still tinged with just a touch of crime. So I hope you'll subscribe, follow, and do all of those things if you aren't already to keep up with this series. If you want to get more of the show, then I'd love for you to join me on Patreon. The lowest paid tiers on there get access to my audiobook readings. I'm currently reading The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells, and a couple more chapters just dropped over there, so you have half the book to catch up on already. So if you want more, Patreon is where you get it, and thanks for considering it. It really makes a huge difference and helps to bring me one step closer to bringing you my spooky stories full time, which is my dream. But now it's time to get your stretchiest pair of eating trousers on, because we're about to head out on the streets for a meal like no other. Since the time when Romans first settled in Londinium, vendors have sold food on the streets. Due to the Thames and its tidal waters, oysters have been a popular food for many. Nowadays, these simple shellfish being given delicacy status and sold by the platter for ridiculous amounts of money. But back in the day, the humble oyster was the food of the poor, the plat du jour for the common man. In the boundaries of the square mile, oyster shells have been found by many archaeologists trying to unearth the history of the city's past. The humble oyster always appearing to show that at one time this was the standard snack of choice. The Thames provided a bountiful choice of food, and as the population started to boom in the early 1800s, sellers opted for things which could be sold raw, or which would last for a while once cooked. Eels, which were abundant in the Thames, were easy to catch, and once cooked and prepared, either by smoking or preserving in aspic, a type of savoury jelly, would then be good for a while as long as it was kept cool. A very easy prospect during the cooler months, which London has the majority of the time. Eel pie became a staple of street food, and after a while, when commercial farming began, minced beef pies also fell into the category of food which could be cooked in huge batches and which would last and stay fresh for days on end. As street food vendors were exempt from many taxes, it was a good way to make a living, but you had to be adaptable, often able to carry food on your head in baskets, or be lucky enough to have a shop front which would basically be a full smorgasbord on display. And you'd need to be happy to work all hours to fit into the long hours people kept. Factory workers usually worked 16-hour days, 6 days a week, and so they would be hungry after their long shifts. Pea soup, pies and seafood were the most common street foods, and stewed fruit, particularly apples, also often a pie, was a very common post-work meal. The street vendors made their prices very reasonable and worked off the principle of selling more at cheaper prices was the best way to go, and sell out they did. In a population which was just creeping over 1 million, an estimated 6,000 food vendors existed, which is 0.6%, a reasonable number for the size of the city. Vendors also went door to door to sell, a tradition which has all but died out in the UK now, but even when I was younger, I remember there being door to door fishmongers, a fish and chip man, the meat man, aka the butcher, and even a milkman which doubled as a baker selling cakes. A holdover from this time of door-to-door street vending. Nowadays, with more supermarkets and delivery on demand, the door-to-door hawking has given way to Deliveroo and Uber Eats, but there was something special about the surprise element of what you could buy from whoever turned up at your doorstep. Anyway, let's reverse out of memory lane and get back to the story. As the streets of London were lined with tasty morsels, it was no doubt that at some point things would go missing from stalls. The odd loaf of bread, a brace of pheasants, a string of sausages stolen by a stray dog, all things which would have gone, for the most part, unnoticed. However, when one man began brazenly stealing from hard-working stall holders and restaurateurs, he became a local working-class hero. But not everyone thought his antics were big and clever. Edward Dando was born around about 1803. Not much is known about his early life, but it's believed he studied to be a hatter, a dangerous profession in which the practitioner would be exposed to dangerous chemicals, particularly mercury, which was used to cure felt. As mercury can be absorbed and passed through cells, usually by breathing in vapour, it can easily pass through the blood-brain barrier, becoming a neurotoxin which can cause symptoms of psychosis and hallucinations. However, we don't know if this was the case for Dando, but it would explain some of his strange behaviour he would go on to exhibit. Now, for some reason, Edward was out of work and didn't seem to be keen to find a job. At the age of just 23, in 1826, he decided that he would instead just take what he thought was rightfully his. He was offered to go on poor relief, but he decided against it, saying he had a soul above it. So with that in mind, Edward had little other option than to turn to thievery to survive. But he wouldn't go down the standard route. Instead, he would be canny yet bold, and be perhaps the first person to turn the dine and dash into a way to survive. But that wasn't all. Edward had a voracious appetite, one which wasn't easily satiated. His meals were vast and never-ending, and his bills would often be more than one person could earn in a day's work. At his first reported steal of a meal deal, he racked up quite the bill. And I bet Edward would have had quite the food coma after it. But you know what would have got him out of it? A go on an online escape room. Are you fed up of scrolling through streaming services and feeling like you're glued to your phone? Well, if like me, you'd rather spend your Saturday night roaming around a haunted house, then I've got something brand new for you which is equal parts fun, intriguing, a little bit spooky, and gets the old brain box ticking. Wolf Escape Games creates immersive, cinematic online escape room adventures that you can play with your partner, your mates, or even solo, if you're brave enough. I played one of their games, Hallows Hill, with my other half recently, and I absolutely loved it. The story unfolds in a haunted house with a tragic past, and as you solve the puzzles, the mystery begins to unfold in a way that really gets under your skin, and will leave you thinking about it for days, if not weeks afterwards. Hallows Hill is atmospheric, clever, and just the right amount of creepy. Honestly, we got so invested and involved that there were definitely a few surprising turns we didn't expect to take, and only a couple of minor squabbles over who was right. But the game I can't wait to try is their Victorian murder mystery, which is Sherlock Holmes themed. Phantom's Hour. It looks so up my alley, and I know it's going to be right up yours too. If you love things which are on the darker side, solving cryptic clues, and that rush you get when everything finally clicks together, these escape games are for you. And for something entirely different, which will get you into summer holiday mode, you can turn up the heat in Miami Bay, set in 1980s Florida. You'll go undercover, fly planes, and play high-stakes poker to crack the case. Also, these games are so reasonably priced and well worth it. They're so beautifully made and well thought out that you're going to want to play them all. All you need is Wi-Fi, a bit of brain power, and someone to share the excitement with. Or not, you can play them on your own too. So if you're ready to try something different this summer and have an evening in like no other, then head to wolfescapegames.com and use the code Macabre30 for a fantastic 30% off games and gift cards, and these really do make a fabulous gift for that person who you just don't know what to get. They also do bundle deals too, so if you fancy the look of a few titles, which I know you will, I can't stress just how addictive and fun these games are. That's wolfescapegames.com, link in the show notes, and let me know what you think once you've played one. You're gonna have an absolute blast. So Edward's first dine and dash was perhaps a test, just to see what he could get away with. He consumed 2 pint pots of ale alongside almost a kilo of beef and onions. A reasonably hefty meal for just one man, but not hugely out of the realms of possibility to knock back in one go. However, consumption of food in this amount would have been rare back then, but if that was all you were going to eat for a few days, you can see why Edward would have scoffed back as much as he could. This first reported minor infraction didn't incur a charge, and Dando was let off with an apology to the alehouse owners. But this didn't stop him. However, it would be 2 further years before he was caught again for his misdemeanours. Now, whether Edward decided to go straight during this time, or just got really good at running away, we don't know. But in 1830, he carried out another scoffathon at a public house, where he ate almost a kilo of meat, a 4-pound loaf of bread, but he couldn't have that dry, so he also smeared 7 pats of butter onto it. That equates to about 14 tablespoons, or basically half a pack of butter. Then, feeling quite thirsty from all the salt, one would imagine, he then washed it down with not just 1 or 2 cups of tea, but 4 whole teapots full. 11 cups in total. This time, feeling a bit weighed down, he didn't run, he just refused to pay for the meal. The owner of the establishment called the local law enforcement, and they arrived and arrested him and took him down to the station to sleep it off. The following day, a magistrate decided that Edward needed to learn a lesson, and so he sentenced him to 1 month, living inside a house of correction. Now, a house of correction was an interesting place. It was a holdover from the Poor Relief Act of the 1600s and basically provide earned living accommodation for the occupants. If you found yourself without a job and without a home, you could be swept up off the streets and put in a house of correction, which would force you to work. The newly imposed Vagrancy Act of 1824 also played a similar role in trying to keep the streets clean, in inverted commas. By making rough sleeping illegal, it aimed to stop begging and street harassment, but the poorhouses were often crammed full, rife with disease, and were equally just as bad as prison life, with food being incredibly meagre. But that didn't stop Dando. Once inside his new home in Brixton, he had to be separated from his fellow roommates because he kept taking everyone's food. This gave Edward somewhat of a better deal, as he was separated for meal times and also spent time on his own away from others when they realised he would just take whatever he wanted from others with no sense of shame at all about doing so. Alongside the snacks he stole, he would also take people's clothing and manage to upgrade himself as he went, meaning by the time he left the House of Correction, he had a much smarter set of clothes than when he went in. Even though he would have been inside with people who were equally as poor as him, sets of clothing were held onto for posterity back then. So if you once had a smart jacket, you would keep that and wear it always. So even if the owner may have fallen on hard times, they'd still own things from times when they weren't so hard up. And even after his month in the House of Correction, Edward had no plans to leave a changed man. On his day of release, and seemingly rather famished, he went straight to an oyster house. in his now slightly smarter clothing, and ordered himself a veritable feast, one which I think anyone would struggle to ingest. Even though oysters were considered to be a snack which was readily available, these slightly more upper-class establishments provided a sit-down experience, not just your grab-and-go from a street seller's noggin basket. Now, if you're a lover of seafood, this may seem like heaven to you, but if you're anything like me and can't stand the stuff, particularly shellfish, all except prawns and lobster, I have got some class, then this seems utterly gross to me. Edward sat down at the oyster house and ordered round after round of raw oysters, and the obedient staff just kept bringing them to him. He managed to down around 75 of the slippery sea biscuits and a chunk of bread and ale before the proprietor asked him to pay up, and when he didn't, he kicked him out, serving his own justice in the form of a few blows to his full gut. Edward made a hasty escape and went and hid for a few hours before emerging back out onto the busy streets of London. Feeling peckish again, he dipped into a very busy oyster house and used this to his advantage, ordering from different staff members. After having his 13th tray of 12 oysters delivered, he decided that might be enough, but not before he again paired it with a £4 loaf and kept requesting bottles of ginger beer, large ones, so around 5 litres of the stuff went down his gullet. After having consumed 156 oysters in total at this establishment, the ginger beer was to settle Edward's stomach, as he said he was feeling somewhat gaseous. Yeah, I bet he was. 231 oysters down in one day is no mean feat. That's got to be an incredibly risky game to play with your digestive system. Edward, no doubt feeling far too full to run, accepted his fate and was once again in front of a judge. He apologised and said he couldn't help it, as he was hungry after his month in the House of Correction. But the judge didn't pity this gluttony, and this time a recommendation was made to remove Edward from the city, where temptation was at its greatest for the hungry man. As news of Edward's exploits hit the papers, people became enthralled by his wild behaviour. In this new era of industry, people were working all the hours God sent, and yet they were still living in poverty, starving, and full of disease. Dando's devil-may-care approach made him a kind of culinary Robin Hood, but in which he was just feeding himself and not actually passing it on to others. His attitude towards making sure he was well fed seemed outlandish, but he kind of had a point. It didn't seem fair that he should be forced to work, and yet he still wouldn't be able to afford a decent, albeit rather gargantuan meal, a succulent seafood meal. In fact, many people disagreed enormously with Edward's imprisonment for his crimes. As some saw it, these were matters of debts which should be settled outside of a house of correction. Others saw them as theft and, as such, decided they should be justly punished in the same way others would, like housebreakers or robbers. Sending him to the tougher and stricter House of Correction in Guildford in Surrey for 3 months this time, it was hoped that this stricter environment and new location would dissuade Edward from committing further crimes, but it seemed his mind was immovable. In all reality, the amount that Edward stole was negatable, a small amount in the grand scheme of things, and thus he wasn't really causing any great nuisance. But if these crimes were able to be witnessed by others, the law spread around them would no doubt create such a legend that others would feel they could get away with it too. Dando, after all, was becoming a folk hero. He was quoted as saying, "I refuse to starve in a land of plenty. Instead, I shall follow the example of my betters by running into debt without having the means of paying." Why, some men live in great extravagance and luxury, owe money and cheat their creditors, yet they are still considered respectable and honest. I only run into debt to satisfy the craving of hunger, and yet I am despised and beaten. But even before Edward was seen before a magistrate, the hue and cry would often catch him out, and he'd be spotted along the street looking for his next mark. He also accepted that he would regularly receive a beating for his miscreant behaviour, and saw this as his payment, even though he thought this to be terrible. But play stupid games, win stupid prizes. Some establishments even capitalised on his outlandishness. If they let him dine for free and then got him caught, they'd receive free advertising in the press for their premises. So even though Edward thought he was the one doing the duping, the tables could equally be turned upon him. Out of his stint at the stricter correction house at Guildford, Edward made his way back to London the very same day, and guess what? He was straight back to his old tricks. This time he stole a £4 loaf of bread, 11 pats of butter, and just a meagre 132 oysters. He was seen before the magistrate the very same day, and as Edward was now becoming a bit of a minor celebrity, he was let off scot-free. It also didn't seem that Dando had any sign of stopping his antics, and that another stay in a correctional house just wasn't worth the spend on their part. As he left the court building, the owner of the establishment he'd robbed threw a bucket of stinky oyster water all over Edward and rained down several blows upon him with his walking stick. This, of course, also made the papers and only did more to boost Dando's notoriety, making it difficult for him to continue living his free life. As Edward's star was rising in London, he walked a fine line of being heralded and hated for his actions. Some establishments welcomed him with open arms, others threw him out as soon as he stepped over the threshold. Magistrates got fed up of seeing him in court and threw out a few more House of Correction stays, but also Edward managed to go for months on end without being put away. But eventually the novelty began to wear off. His gluttony was becoming something which was beginning to turn people's stomachs, and it seemed unfair that Dando should eat for free when they had to foot the bill. As his binges became more prevalent and numerous, going from establishment to establishment, people took matters into their own hands and just began regularly beating Edward up. This gave him a limp, and when he was discovered drunk, bloodied and covered in mud in a gutter in Knightsbridge one late afternoon, it was suggested he may want to leave London or fear for his life. In a bid to escape the heat he'd attract in the city, Edward went on a tour of Kent, going from town to town, carrying out his usual behaviour of dining and dashing. When he was apprehended by a group of locals for his bad behaviour, he was thrown over to the police, who took him to the magistrate. The sentence was this time upgraded to a stint behind bars, and so Edward was packed off to Coldbath Fields Prison. His penance in prison would be to undergo the kinds of daily torture which was enacted at that time, busy work which did nothing. Prisoners were lined up on revolving wheels, which they walked upon for hours on end, much like a hamster wheel. This pointless task did nothing but tire prisoners out. The treadwheel was sometimes used to harvest human power to power mills or pump water, but the majority of the time, the whole act was just to simply provide prisoners with a task which they knew would do nothing. A psychologically and physically demanding drain which was cruel and unnecessary, and which would often lead to the operator repenting their sins in the hope they'd be allowed to stop. In terms of the medieval torture rack or the treadwheel, I'd take the rack any day. It seems far easier than the wheel, and that's saying something. As soon as he arrived, he was up to his ravenous ways, and perhaps intrigued by just how much he could put away, his guards obliged his request for food. As he ate and drank, he put away a vast amount, his belly distending as he shoveled more and more in. However, with every mouthful he took, washing it down with a drink, Edward didn't realise he was supping on cholera-infested water. The illness which thrives in faecally infested water was now ripping through his system, and within a matter of minutes, he had a rising temperature. As his body became rapidly infected, he became stuck to his chair, too weak to move. A prison guard quickly sprung into action and carried him to the infirmary, but within a matter of hours, Edward would pass away, and so too would the prison guard who tried to save him. He was just 29 years old. The unrelenting, quick and violent death which had ripped through much of London was rife in prisons, and as you can imagine, trying to eliminate it from houses of correction was not high on the government's list of priorities. After all, dead prisoners meant less money spent out, a tough but harrowing fact which was obvious to the general public. The creeping threat of cholera was an evil omnipresence for the residents of the city. Until Dr. John Snow worked out that sewage, which was seeping from people's basements, was being drawn into the water pumps they were drinking from, the general public had no idea where this creeping death was coming from, and it crossed the rich and poor divide. Whole families were wiped out in a matter of hours, houses sat empty. In the worst cases, the whole house would die out in a matter of hours, and no one would realise for a few days, the stench eventually emanating out into the streets and neighbouring houses. Cholera was a modern plague which caused a horrific death toll and wiped out a huge chunk of the population. And for someone who was so full of life, such as Edward, it showed the disease was inescapable. Edward's story was a true tale of unabashed bold-as-brass behaviour. In some ways, he was right. Why should he have to live in poverty when he lived in a land of plenty? But the actions of one man was not enough to upset the status quo. Had he really wanted to start a revolution, Edward could have begun a movement, but he did seem rather a lone wolf. And I personally feel that if he was really hell-bent on selling his thefts as for the greater good, he wouldn't have stolen the meagre rations of his cellmates in prison. That doesn't stink of benevolence to me, rather selfishness. But nonetheless, his story did make a good point, and it reached the most prevalent of Victorian documenters, Charles Dickens. He wrote a number of years later after Dando's death that when Edward was buried at Coldbath Field, that his prison guards would decorate his grave with oyster shells. A nice idea, but within the confines of a cholera-ridden hellhole, he would have been dumped in the ground along with the countless others who joined him in meeting the Grim Reaper at that time. William Makepeace Thackeray also wrote of Dando and his exploits and turned it into a play called The Professor, which would go on to be popular on the stage. Edward's refusal to fit the confines of society made him an audacious personality, which was at odds with the unrelenting lowering hand of capitalism, which was hovering over the residents of London. As the hand grasped, squashed and flattened many of the city's residents, Edward managed to escape its clutches for many years, but would always come out battered and bruised. The magistrate who sent Dando to prison may well have known he was delivering a death sentence, but even though he was physically no longer around, Edward's legend lived on for decades after his death. His name became a synonym for eating without paying, and doing a Dando was a term which was bandied around in many pubs and restaurants, even if it was just down to the sheer quantity of food put away by patrons. So whilst the era of the great scoffer was over, his legacy lived on, and I say we bring it back. Maybe not actually do a dine and dash yourself, but maybe have a lovely feast and toast to Dando, the cheeky oyster snaffler of London. Thanks for joining me for this episode. Let me know how many oysters you reckon you could eat in one sitting. I'm not eating oysters, but I reckon I could do quite a few rounds of scampi. If you've made it this far and you just want to let me know you're a true part of the Ghoul Gang, then please leave me the oyster emoji in the comments on YouTube or Spotify. Yes, I know it looks suspicious, but just go with it. I kind of like it. Next episode, we'll be picking back up with crime and punishment in the capital city, and we're about to travel into the world of the East End during the fearful time of Jack the Ripper prowling the streets. And I'm looking forward to exploring that infamous case with the police steer upon it, as it reveals more than you'll expect, and perhaps some things you've never encountered before. If you want to help me create this content, it's as easy as throwing a few quid my way on Patreon in return for some pretty good extras, including early and ad-free episodes. And all donations help me to keep up with my costs, like newspaper archive subscriptions, books I need to buy for research, Wi-Fi and editing costs, and everything that goes into this podcast. So if you can part with a few pounds a month in return for extra content, then I'd love to see you over there. A big thanks to my amazing top tier Patreon producers, Christina, Heather's Leg, Mary, Matilda, Ravel, Sally, Sam, Sarah, Terry and Veronica, and all of our other fantastic patrons too. Your support really does keep everything going, and it means the world. If you want your name read out in the episodes or listed in the show notes, join us on Patreon at patreon.com/Macabre London. I'd love to personally welcome you to the Ghoul Gang and have a natter about the latest episodes. Thanks for joining me for another Macabre Mini Mystery. I've been Nikki Druce. Remember to stay spooky, and I'll see you ghouls next time. Oh, she's got her nails back. Yeah.